What's going on, guys? Josh here from Momentum Productions, and today I'm going to be showing you how to get awesome slow motion footage while using a gimbal. In today's video, I'm going to be referring back to the ZHIYUN Crane Plus and the ZHIYUN Crane 2. Now, why would you ever want to use slow motion? I know that's kind of an obvious answer to give, but slow motion allows us to capture things that we normally wouldn't see in normal motion. For example, we can accentuate scenes by using slow motion. We can also exaggerate scenes. We can make things last longer and just really focus on a specific emotion, topic, or subject. Sometimes when we shoot things in real motion and then export it in real motion, things just go by too fast and we want to get more time with that specific scene or subject. So slow motion is definitely a great tool to help accentuate a certain mood, genre, topic, or scene. Also, character too. First things first, let's talk about the best settings for your camera. Rule of thumb is you want to double your shutter speed according to your frame rate. What's the optimum frame rate? Well, go as high as your camera allows, but try not to lose any resolution in the process. So for example, if your camera can shoot at 120 frames per second in full HD, use that setting. Now for Sony cameras, I know that there is a preset button or dial, like on my A9 for example, there is a slow motion option on the dial. Don't use that because it actually drops the bit rate and you don't get as much data as if you would set the camera to 120 frames per second in the general menu. So keep that in mind. Stay away from that dial because it drops the quality and the bit rate. Go within your internal camera settings and increase that frame rate to 120 frames per second. When we go back to talking about shutter speed, again, the general rule of thumb is to double your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 120 frames per second, shoot at 1/240th shutter speed. However, this rule can be broken for good and for bad. For example, if you don't want to capture a lot of motion blur, feel free to increase that shutter speed to, let's say, 1/400th or 1/500th. I've done this on multiple fitness shoots. It makes a lot of the shots come out crispier and you don't get that blurry footage, especially if you decide to freeze frame. Now here's the downside to increasing that shutter speed. You do lose a lot of that realism and that motion blur, but honestly, those are the two of the main things that you're gonna lose. So if that's not important to you, feel free to increase that shutter speed. You can also benefit from that because you don't have to use an ND filter. This will automatically decrease the exposure in your shot. Now let's say we decrease the shutter speed below the recommended limits. For example, if I'm shooting at 60 frames per second and I'm recording everything at 1/50th shutter speed and you decide to play everything back in slow motion, you are going to get very choppy and blurry slow motion. I would never go below these recommended limits because it can cause a lot of problems for you in post-production. However, if you do increase the shutter speed, you can always add motion blur, and honestly, it's a lot better to increase the shutter speed than to decrease the shutter speed. But when you know exactly what kind of shot you want to capture and you want realism and motion blur and you want everything to go by the book, then definitely double the frame rate when it comes down to shutter speeds. So again, the rule of thumb is when you're shooting at 60 frames per second, shoot at 1/120th shutter speed. Just keep doubling up that number. But rules are meant to be broken, so I'm gonna leave that up to you. Next, let's talk about why you would want to use slow motion for a certain shot. For example, this shot here, we have a low angle shot of Jason Vong's shoes, and you can see each individual drop of water come off of it as he's walking through the water. This is a great close-up / slow motion shot, but why did I decide to go for that slow motion? Well, I wanted to exaggerate the movement. And by that, I mean make everything move a lot slower, especially when it comes down to those water droplets. I wanted to see those individual droplets as best as I could. So that's another reason why increasing your shutter speed will help capture a crispier shot when you have a lot of little objects that are moving quickly. When it comes down to filming people's faces, capturing their emotions and reactions to certain things, definitely capture that in slow motion. You would be surprised how much better your shots will look. When you're exaggerating a person's happy mood, you make everybody else who's watching your footage happier. Believe it or not, make your viewers feel emotion just like the characters in your shots are feeling that emotion. And by the way, don't be limited to just using your gimbal. Handheld shots get away with a lot of good things too, so make sure you check out this video here where I talk about when to use a gimbal and when to use handheld. Sometimes it can also be difficult to decide whether or not slow motion is right for your shoot. So if that's the case, shoot at the highest frame rate possible. But make sure you're not capturing audio with that highest frame rate possible. Because if you do decide to export your shots in 24 frames per second, if you're capturing audio, you might have some syncing issues. Sometimes it might lag or go faster than normal. You don't want to have those issues. So make sure that all of the shots that you need audio with are captured in the same exact settings that you plan on exporting your project. Most of my shots were shot using 60 frames per second, and I exported them in 24 frames per second. Every now and then, I might have added some artificial motion blur, but you probably can't really tell. Everything still comes out really smooth. Also, wide shots are another great way to capture things in slow motion. For example, I have a model here walking on the beach, and this was shot using the Crane Plus. I shot this at 120 frames per second, and my idea was to capture the Santa Monica Pier in the background and have her hair blowing in the wind as well. This was just a feel-good type of shot, and I wanted my audience to feel that exact same way. When it comes down to operating your gimbal, I do strongly suggest checking out my tutorials here for the ZHIYUN Crane and actually any other gimbal that's on the market today. Those tutorials are greatly going to help you, especially this basics tutorial right here. So make sure you check that video out. When it comes down to tracking shots, don't forget that slow motion adds a very dramatic effect. So feel free to shoot a lot of your tracking shots in slow motion as well, because in post-production you can do a lot with 120 frames per second footage or 60 frames per second footage. Try to capture all of your B-roll shots in the highest frame rate possible. When you have the flexibility of capturing things in a higher frame rate, you can do so much. You can make things look dreamy, artificial, add motion blur. You can do literally whatever you want. So I'm going to stress this again. Capture your B-roll shots in the highest frame rate possible, but make sure that you don't lose any quality in your resolution. Also, using the vertigo effect with the Crane 2 adds a lot to your footage. It adds skill, it adds dimension and depth. So capture those shots in slow motion when possible, because it accentuates that movement. It accentuates that stretch from the foreground and the background. So consider that in your next shoot. So that's how I capture slow motion with my Crane gimbals and my cameras. So if this video has helped you out, please give it a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel with notifications on. I will also leave links in the description box below that will guide you in your purchasing decisions for your camera gear. So make sure you check that out. I can't wait to see what you create, and I'll talk to you soon. Peace.